Welcome to State of the State, the monthly roundup of policy and research for the state of Michigan, brought to you by the Institute of Public Policy and Social Research at Michigan State Universities and our friends here at MSU Radio Studios. I'm Arnold Weinfeld, Associate Director for the Institute, and joining me as always are our co-hosts, Institute Director Dr. Matt Grossmann and economist Dr. Charley Ballard. Well, Matt and Charley, since the last time we were here, 2/3 of a summer has gone by. I hope you've had a chance to enjoy it. Despite what the news brings us from the Southwest and the South, it's been a rather delightful summer, I think, here in Michigan.
Good time to live in Michigan.
Good time to live in Michigan.
This summer.
Yes, indeed. I still say we ought to put billboards down in Phoenix showing their temperature as compared to various cities in Michigan if we're trying to attract population. And we'll talk about the governor's new commission on population loss. We've also had a state budget put in place with money for everyone almost, it seems. And we'll also talk today about the state economy and the impact of recent Supreme Court decisions, of course, affirmative action being the big one there. But let's start with the state budget. And the economy. Charley, the economy seems to keep rolling along.
The economy continues to roll along. Various economists have been talking about the possibility of a recession for a year. We've been talking about it in these podcasts for a year, and it's always been, well, might happen, not sure. The news continues to be pretty good. The July employment numbers just came out earlier this morning, and the national economy gained 187,000 jobs. National unemployment rate stays essentially constant at 3.5%. Michigan's unemployment rate, which used to be a little bit higher, has come down to 3.6%. It remains to be seen. The Federal Reserve just recently raised interest rates another notch. They still are worried about inflation, even though inflation is down substantially from what it was a year ago. They're still trying to tap on the brakes, but whereas a few months ago I would have said a mild recession is more likely than not, right now, I would say more likely than not is that we kind of skirt the edges of a recession and
I think you
go
did
on.
say that on this program a few months ago.
I did. We could go through back through the tapes. It's a pretty good scenario after really a year of Fed interest rate increases. Now, of course, I'm an economist, so you know that I can't just say everything is hunky-dory. So, of course, there are things to worry about. Gas prices are up a little bit. We were talking just a few minutes ago about the Fitch downgrading of U.S. Treasury debt. I think that's really more a long-term problem than a short-term one, which I'd be happy to talk about. I've been warning about our skyrocketing debt for 40 years, and nobody seems to have paid any attention, but I'll continue to warn about it. One other that I think is noteworthy, especially for Michigan, is that the contract talks are now underway between the United Auto Workers and the auto companies, and the deadline is September 14th. So we've got 6 weeks or so, and right now the parties are a galaxy apart. Yeah. Of course, that's the way it usually goes in negotiations. You don't start out close together and then you inch more closely. I hope we can get through this without a strike.
Well, we got the UPS folks to agree to a contract, it looks like, which nationally, of course, would have had huge implications for supply chain issues that are probably still already tenuous. But you're right. Here in Michigan, we're all looking at that big three contract talks. You said they're a galaxy apart. I read the other day in Cranes where the UAW president was quoted as saying that our asks are going to be audacious. So,
well, I think audacious is not a bad description for. I mean, they've asked for a great deal. I think, and they go into it knowing they're not going to get everything that they ask for. Neither is the other side. I always hope that cooler heads prevail, and Cooler heads usually prevail at about 11:59 and 52 seconds on the relevant day.
Well, there's so much to think about in these auto talks, too, with the continuing transition to electric vehicles and what that's going to mean 3, 5, 10 years from now for the auto industry. Matt, what's the politics of all this? I mean, obviously, a strike would not be good for not just the state of Michigan, but the country as a whole. Going into the fall, it gets colder, the skies get grayer, people's moods change from the brightness of summer. A strike would not be good for Governor Whitmer or President Biden, would it?
Well, no, and the current public view does not reflect your sunny optimism of the weather or Charley's sunny optimism about the economy. People are still pretty dour. You do see, some changes in consumer confidence that reflect the economic trends, but the level is still quite low, and that's reflected in Biden getting no credit and lots of blame for the current state of the economy. So more negative economic news would only hurt that. There is an interesting, just like there's a gulf between the actual economic statistics and the current economic mood, there's also kind of a gulf in perceptions of the current state of the unions and strikes because the prospective and actual strikes have been taking place in such high-profile industries. So when you have the actors and the writers on strikes, when you have things that hit the news regularly, it can seem like we're in a summer of lots of labor strife. And when you have things like, Starbucks being unionized, people trying to unionize businesses that people have heard of and maybe go to daily, then you get the sense that maybe, unionization is somehow on the rise. But really, we're still in the middle of a long-term decline in unionization, and there isn't really much of a trend in the effects of that directly on the economy.
Mm-hmm.
The fraction of the national workforce that's members of a union has been trending slowly but surely downward for 70 years now. So even if there were some increase in successful union organizing activities, it would still leave labor unions much smaller relative to the economy than they were in the 40s and 50s.
Well, let's turn to a minute now to the state budget, because despite the back and forth here on the economy, perceptions, folks out there thinking, with the rising prices and everything, we're still in a bit of a bind. Certainly, the state legislature and the Democratic majority in the House and the Senate, along with the governor, just spent like drunken sailors, as the term was coined by former Governor Blanchard, because they have the money. We have unbelievably a budget surplus here in the state of Michigan currently, along with leftover money from the American Relief Act. And I got a missive the other day from the governor's office that she sent out to any number of folks. I'm not so special, but...
you are special,
no,
Arnold.
I'm not so special.
Yeah, you are.
But it sounded more like a national promo piece than anything else, because, of course, all that's good in Michigan is due to the governor, not because she has Democratic majorities in the House and the Senate. But as a former House staffer, I'll let that go for now. But she notes that the FY24 budget lowers costs on health care, preschool, meals for kids, increased higher education, provides money for housing and work training, will help fix roads, bridges, replace lead plate, promote public safety. I don't know, anything and everything that Michiganders are concerned about is going to be fixed in this budget. Reflections on the budget. I mean, this was the one budget that the legislature really had an opportunity to fund some programs, because, as we all know, back to the other side of the coin, after this, it doesn't look so pretty.
Yeah, I guess you say there's plenty of money, and if there's money, it tends to be spent. Although I think if we had a Republican majority in either of the houses of the legislature, less would have been spent. And I'd turn to Matt to try to parse how much of it is that we have united government under Democratic Party control for the first time in 40 years, or how much of it is other factors. But a part of it is that our economy is doing pretty well, and that means revenue is coming in reasonably well, and that's the really remarkable resilience of the American economy in the years coming out of the COVID. Really pretty good, pretty robust growth, which means there's more money to be spent.
So, Matt, Governor Whitmer is certainly, and state Democrats seem to be at an apex of their agenda right now. What do you think the impact is politically for them here in the state and moving forward? We also let's also throw in there the recalls that are on the table too.
Well, it was an everything for everyone budget. It isn't that dissimilar from what's happening across the country. As Charley noted, it's mainly about general economic factors being better and more federal money coming in. And even Republican state governments have been a little quieter about their I'm going to send back this Biden money views, and are willing to spend the money when it comes down to it. And so actually there is an effect of full Democratic control on state spending, but it's actually a lot smaller than you might expect, and much smaller than the year-to-year differences due to the overall state of the economy and due to the share of federal money that gets sent to the states. Both of those factors matter more, and I would say have mattered more here than Democratic control. In terms of what was the second?
The recalls.
Oh,
there are recalls.
Well, the political impact. So, as we've talked about before, people always want the political impact to be, I passed a lot of things, and therefore people are going to reward me. The actual effect is more often the reverse. So the more that state governments are able to pass and move the agenda in their direction, the more likely that in the next election they lose ground rather than gain ground. It's still a small effect relative to how the overall national picture is going, but you can see it if you look at the national electorate relative to, say, when Kansas and Wisconsin went far to the right in the prior legislative period, they saw more of a relative move to the left in their elections. And that tends to be a national pattern, and also tends to be true when state governments move further to the left. So that doesn't mean the Democrats are set to lose the next election, but that's the overall direction of the relationship between policy and election. It's not the one that elected officials would like to be the case.
Right. And interestingly enough, this week, underlying that, as I mentioned, are a series of recalls that are being attempted, although one recall petition against a Republican House member who voted to affirm Speaker Tate's appointment as Speaker is the only one that was approved by the State Board of Canvassers, but I believe there are 6 others sitting on the table for Democratic state reps, and there are 2 Democratic House members that are running for mayor of their respective communities in November. So there's any number of underlying pieces as we move into the fall, including now the governor's announcement that she's going to have a fall policy agenda announcement. So it's interesting to me, just the governor has said she's not a candidate for president, but yet a lot of the moves coming out of her office have a national edge to it, announcements of how much she's done for the state of Michigan, a fall policy agenda, and the like. And I do wonder where all this is going, where, as Matt noted, a recent poll showed the abbreviation NOTA, none of the above, getting 13% of the vote in a Trump-Biden election. So the American public is not very excited about a replay of what we've seen.
Many prognosticators on the national scene have listed Gretchen Whitmer as a potential presidential candidate, and I'm pretty sure she's aware of that, and so that has implications. I don't I don't see it as at all likely that she would be the 2024 nominee. That's still much more likely to be Joe Biden versus Donald Trump, which most people don't want, but that's what it's likely to be. Matt, I was curious about you've written that party control doesn't make as much of a difference in outcomes as we might think. Clearly, the switch to Democratic Party control has made some difference. Would you call it tiny or modest or fairly big?
Well, in policy, this has been a very large shift on the scale of state government year-to-year shifts. That is what you would expect after a period of prolonged lack of control from a party. So it's usually the very first legislature following new party control that you see the most change, and that's been true here, was true in Virginia and in Minnesota as well. So there have been other similarly sized shifts, and that's kind of how I would attribute it. We usually distinguish between the policy outputs and the actual outcomes. So the question is all of that going to make a difference to things like economics or population or things that people say they are trying to affect through policies? And that's where it's really harder to find any consistent relationship between state party control and those outcomes, because there's slippage at both stages. There's slippage between who's in charge and what policies do they pass, and then of course there's a lot of slippage between what policies are actually passed and what outcomes do they achieve.
Yeah, I've said many times that there's so much. Michigan is 3% of the national population, 2.5% of the national economy. We're in this little life raft floating upon a gigantic ocean of the worldwide economy, and if those waves are big, they're gonna affect our boat. One of my favorite examples is that John Engler was the economy, as he would remind you, did very well in the 90s when he was governor. And then in the last 2.5 years of his administration, Michigan lost 250,000 jobs. He didn't do anything differently, but the national and international scene changed. And there's very little that any governor can or member of the state legislature can do really to control those big, broad economic and demographic trends.
Yeah, and I wouldn't overstate the backlash, Arnold. I think we've had hundreds of recall attempts. Very few make them to the ballot. I think one actually succeeded. So very high ratio of noise to actual outcomes when it comes to those kinds of backlash. But, it is true that, there's still going to be more people animated by saying, what you did went too far, usually than the reverse.
Of course, here in Michigan, when we hear recalls, those of us that have been around Michigan politics long enough remember how John Engler came to power through recalls many, many years ago. And so recalls for some of us send a shiver up our spine. But speaking about the large boat upon waves, one of the issues that the governor is seeking to address, and it's not a new issue. It's one I know, Charlie, you and I have worked on together since the beginning of this century, and I'm going to call it the beginning of the century because we're 23 years into it, and that's population loss. And the governor has announced a new commission to devise strategies and initiatives to help address population loss. I'm really wondering if this is, again, one of those items that there's really not much we can do about it because of national trends.
The first thing that I want to say about that is that I think population loss is maybe not the right thing to say. The population of Michigan hasn't been dropping steadily in this century. It's just been flat. Mm-hmm. It's been, in fact, astonishingly flat at basically 10 million plus or minus only a few thousand over the 23 years of this century. So our population isn't dropping overall; it's flat. But then underneath that, there's a maybe more important trend, and that is that more than half of the counties in Michigan have lost population. Some of them have lost a substantial fraction. There are 3 metropolitan counties that have lost a lot of population. That's Wayne County, Saginaw, and Genesee. And we know that Detroit, Flint, and Saginaw are places that have not done that great in this century. But then the others are rural counties. And 13 of the 15 counties in the Upper Peninsula have lost population this century, some of them by more than 10%, even though they're often starting from a small base. But if you got 5,000 people and you lose 1,000 of them, that's major population loss. And for a lot of the areas in Michigan, not so much for the state as a whole, but for a lot of individual areas, population loss is really a concern. It's not a concern in Kent County or Ottawa County or Livingston County or Washtenaw, but it is a concern in a lot of parts of Michigan.
Yes. And the other thing that the population loss way of thinking about it kind of misses is that a lot of the focus should be on improving migration to Michigan. So, births are lower than deaths almost everywhere, and the way that population growth comes, despite that, means that people are moving in. And this, we did a study a few years ago for MEDC where we looked at where college graduates are going in Michigan. But the overall picture is actually we don't have a higher rate of college graduates leaving the state after graduating. What we have is a lower rate of college graduates from elsewhere deciding to move into the state. And that is a part of a broader pattern where our issues are not as much from the perspective of young people moving away as we hear about in the political debate as young people not being attracted to Michigan to move from elsewhere.
We, for a complex variety of reasons, we haven't convinced that 22-year-old who's just graduating from college in California or Texas or New York or Florida to come to Michigan. Of course, if we have a long enough stretches of low temperature of 95 degrees in Phoenix, we may be able to attract.
There are push factors as well as pull
and milder winters here.
Milder
which
winters.
We've seen the last 2 or 3 winters.
That's right. I mean, I'm a big fan of pure Michigan, trying to remind us and the rest of the world that this is a place that has a lot of great advantages. Right. But boy, it's been a tough slog in terms of getting those people to move here.
Right. And as I recall, in the 2020 census, our population grew just slightly, as you noticed, and it was mostly due to immigrants and refugee placement here in the state of Michigan. So we do have, the Lansing area here, Kent County, even in Wayne County, large pockets of immigrant population that have worked to help grow our state's population, which is the American story, isn't it? I mean, that's the way we've been for 300 years.
I have some acquaintances in Lansing who are Iraqi immigrants, and they are the most patriotic Americans that you will ever meet, because if you were born under the regime of Saddam Hussein and you come to America, despite all the problems that we have here, it looks awfully good.
Right. And I do, and Matt makes a great point. Those 20-somethings out of college, or those that even don't go to college, just are not looking to move here as compared to other states. And it's important to remember that high school graduations and birth rates are lowering across the country, not here in Michigan. The brain drain happens everywhere. It's just a natural function of a young person to want to go and check someplace else out. We have to make it so that Pure Michigan campaign is not just about tourism, but about living here and coming here for good. Yep, I agree.
Now, let's say that we succeeded some and we start attracting more people. Then that would lead to another question, which we don't have to worry about much now, but I want to keep in the back of people's minds. How much population growth do we want? Because if you love our beautiful lakes and forests and all the other environmental amenities that we have in Michigan, you might not want too much population
I've
growth.
been in more than one conversation, actually, over the last month about what do we mean by a growth strategy and what is the actual outcome we're seeking. So that's another great point. Let's talk for a moment about Supreme Court case on affirmative action in particular earlier this summer. A couple of years ago, there was another Supreme Court decision on abortion that clearly had implications across the country in elections. And Matt, I'm wondering from your perspective, what are you seeing, hearing, or reading about the implications of this particular Supreme Court decision on the upcoming election?
Well, we're not expecting much of an effect. Nothing like what happened with the Dobbs decision and the backlash, particularly in Michigan. For one thing, the Supreme Court was more in line with public opinion this term than they were the previous term. There's an outfit that polls people on the same questions that the Supreme Court is facing each term. And actually, there was a pretty high level of consistency between how the Supreme Court ruled and public opinion, including on affirmative action. So I wouldn't expect too much of a backlash. I do think it depends for the long term on what the implementation of this looks like. Charlie, you outdate my Michigan time, so you might remember what the conversation was like when this was outlawed in Michigan, and what people expected would be the effects compared to what they ended up being.
My sense is that the effects on enrollments of minority students at Michigan State University and University of Michigan has been modest. It's not an enormous effect. After all, if a university administration wants to have a diverse student body, they don't have to explicitly consider race. There are all sorts of ways that they can. If you have if the MSU admissions office has an open house where they talk to prospective students in Detroit, you don't have to say black students only, but if you do it in Detroit, you have a certain group who's going to come. If you do it in West Bloomfield, it's a different group. And so all of these universities are actively recruiting across a very wide part of the population, and so we didn't see minority students disappear from U of M or MSU or others. I expect that overall the effects might be fairly modest. One thing that I think is very interesting is that this decision has generated a lot of public discussion about legacy admissions that many universities pursue, which means that you're more likely to have the children of your alumni, and of course your alumni are likely to be affluent, and so some universities have abandoned legacy admissions. That might, I think, in the long run have more of an effect.
Well, it still continues the conversation, though, when you say legacy, about how we address legacy issues such as race, in our society. That's going to be a continuing conversation, not just at universities, but across the spectrum, including in the workplace moving forward. So as you know, Charlie, universities in particular do have different strategies and tools available to them if their goal is to increase the diversity of their student population, and not just their student population, but their faculty population as well is another key point. It's going to be interesting to see. Matt, you correctly pointed out that the Supreme Court decision is very much in line with people's thoughts on where they are with affirmative action today. This isn't the first case. The Bakke decision from years ago in the University of Michigan was one that probably set the stage for what this Supreme Court did. And even among Democrats as well, there are mixed feelings on whether or not affirmative action is a good strategy and a good tool.
President Biden has spoken very much in favor of race-based affirmative action, but even among Democrats and certainly among the population as a whole, race-based, as you say, Matt, race-based affirmative action for college admissions is not really a popular thing, and so eliminating it is much less likely to have a big effect.
Right. Well, and like I said, it'll still be interesting to see how we continue to address the inequities that are within our systems.
Well, and this obviously is also part of a larger culture war. And interestingly, in the decision, they opened the way for universities to ask all applicants to assess how race or other factors had affected their individual lives, and that was kind of enabled by the decision. But that's actually the same kind of thing that has generated a large backlash both in schools, universities, and businesses, where people are asked for diversity statements. They're asked about to catalog their views on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and that has also produced a backlash, even though it's an alternative in some ways to explicit affirmative action. So this might actually increase those kinds of conversations if universities seek to shift to that kind of an evaluation.
Mm-hmm. Well, Charlie and Matt, that's about all the time we have today. Any last thoughts as we move into the last few weeks of summer and into fall?
Well, Michigan State University won an award this week that Arnold had a lot to do with for its role as a land-grant university in economic development. So congratulations, Arnold.
Well, thanks, Matt. I appreciate that. Yes, the university was awarded the Association of Public and Land-Grant Universities Innovation and Economic Prosperity designation, which signifies that, as a land-grant university, that's one of our goals, right, is to help our communities move forward and our stakeholders move forward. And as we know, we still have a lot of work to do in that area, too. So hopefully continue to be a part of that. But thank you. Thank you.
Good work.
Thank you. Well, again, that's all the time we have on this edition of State of the State. My thanks again to Russ White and the staff here at MSU Radio Studios for their support of the program. Join us again next